Hey there, my name is Mark Figueiredo, and welcome to my lesson for the summer workshop retreat. I'm so excited to have you here today because in today's lesson, I'm going to show you how to create your own custom rubber stamp, and then we're going to use that rubber stamp and create a bullet journal weekly spread together. It's going to be super fun. A little bit of background on me before we get started. As I mentioned, my name is Mark, and I run the Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube account, Men Who Bullet, where I focus on bullet journaling, organization, and productivity. You can also check out my website, menwhobullet.com. Over there, you can check out my blog post about bullet journaling and organization, as well as sign up for my email newsletter, where I'm sending out monthly freebies to you, as well as ideas, tips, and tricks around bullet journaling and organization as well. Let's go ahead and go over all of the supplies that you're going to need to create your own custom stamp first. Then after that, we'll go ahead and design the stamp, we'll carve it out, and then we'll create that weekly bullet journal spread. I didn't think that when I first started bullet journaling that stamps were ever going to make it into my repertoire. Honestly, I have always been very much focused on functionality inside of my bullet journal, so pens and highlighters were about as far as I have ever gone. But about 6 months ago, I started getting more and more interested inside of stamps because what I found is that I'm not an awesome doodler, and as I'm trying to add some fun into my bullet journal, stamps are a fantastic way to do that. Now, in my past, I'm not unfamiliar to craft stores and stamps and things like that. I used to mess around with some mixed media back in the day, but I had a collection already of some stamps, like these rubber block stamps that we got from different craft stores and shops and things like that. And they're super fun. That they can be a little bit expensive, and honestly, I haven't found like a huge selection of those where I'm super impressed by what's inside of there or how I would use them inside of my bullet journal, honestly. Great for card making and things like that, but not necessarily for this. Over time, I have found these clear acrylic stamps, which are great. They're relatively inexpensive. You can actually find some really cool patterns, and the only things that you need are just these and an acrylic block, and then you're good to go. The first thing that you're going to need is something to carve your stamp into. And in today's lesson, we're going to be using this linoleum rubber block. This is super easy to carve into, a lot easier than regular printmaking linoleum, and it's very inexpensive, and you can find it in almost every store and online as well. Once you have that rubber block, the next thing you need is something to carve into that with, and we're going to be using linoleum cutters to do that. You can find these as great starter kits online that have the rubber block along with the blades as well, or you can just buy these alone if you need to. Most of them come with a handle and different size blades that you can use inside of them. If you're looking for finer detail, I've actually found some great success with these flex cut tools. These are really nice palm sets that get really nice fine detail, and I'm mostly going to be using these today. The other thing that you're going to need is going to be a utility blade or an X-Acto blade. You're going to use this mostly to cut out your rubber block after you lay down your transfer, but you can also use these for fine details and cutting out things inside of your stamp itself. Once you have everything you need for your rubber stamp, the next thing you're going to need is ink to lay that down with. I have found a lot of success with VersaFine ink. I really like it. It works well for the types of stamps that I'm creating, but you can use any type that you want. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, and it could be relatively inexpensive as well. You don't have to go all out for this if you don't want to. Now that you have everything you need to actually create your own rubber stamp, let's talk about transfer methods and getting designs onto the rubber block. For today's method, we're going to be using a graphite transfer. And what that means is we're going to be using a pencil, and we're going to be using tracing paper, and we're going to doodle something onto this paper, and then I'll show you how to do a really nice and easy transfer onto the block so that we can carve our own custom stamp. Along with the pencil, I also recommend some type of pen or fine liner. Because it is pencil and graphite, it can tend to smudge on the rubber, so what you'll see me do is do the transfer and then I go over it real quick with a fine liner just to make sure that it sticks on the page. The last thing that we're going to need is going to be some type of a journal because we're going to be creating these stamps and then putting them into an actual journal. For today's video, I'm going to be using an Archer and Olive notebook. I absolutely love working along with Archer and Olive, and their notebooks are fantastic. They have 160 GSM paper, nice and super thick, so it takes the ink very well without any ghosting or bleeding through the paper. If you don't want to go all out for a notebook, you can also just find some inexpensive notebooks out there. This is just one that has a craft paper cover with blank pages on the inside. I've actually been using this to do some test prints and also having some fun with stamps and designing my own covers for this notebook too. That's everything we're going to need to get started with our lesson today. So let's go ahead and start with designing something. Then I'll show you how to transfer it onto the rubber block, and then we're going to go ahead and carve out our own custom stamp. As we get started, I did want to show you some examples of the types of stamps that I'm making for my bullet journal or planner, because there's so many different ways that you can go about this, and you can really do whatever you want with them, big or small. What I like about creating my own stamps is I can make them whatever I need them to be. So you'll see a lot of the times I might do things like stationery or light bulbs for ideas. I've even done containers like this really cool Polaroid that I can use inside of my bullet journal to represent different things. Most recently, I actually used this one when I was creating an Instagram tracker for myself, and I'm able to quickly create these instead of drawing out every single post-it right inside of my bullet journal. I've also done fun little things like iced coffees and even with some extra scraps, and we'll talk about scraps in just a moment because they are an important part of creating with rubber stamps, is because you can use all these different shapes and sizes as well as carving into the actual rubber stamp or carving out the lines that you're going to be creating, and then from there you can do really fun things like patterns and other pieces like this, whether you're making your own design cover or, as you saw before, adding them right inside of your bullet journal or planner. The first thing that we're going to do in this lesson is actually sketch out what our stamp is going to be. All you're going to need to get started for this one here is going to be your tracing paper or pad and a pencil. The reason that I like using tracing paper is that it isn't expensive. That's a really important part as we're creating these. And also it's a really great way to transfer your drawings over. So I'm just going to pop this under just to show a handful of sketches of things that I've done. Not that I've turned these into stamps just yet, but at any point I want to, I can just easily do that and it'll fit right onto my stamp size. I've done sketches big and small. These are some of the bigger ones that I did earlier on, where I'm just, working within a certain amount of space and creating them. With something like these light bulbs, for instance, these started off as 3 individual sketches, and then I just put them together and transferred them together to get the one stamp that we saw before. What we're going to be working on today is actually small little icons. I find that the icons are the easiest thing to make and create for stamps. And I find them to also be the most usable because you can really utilize these for anything. I've sketched a lot of these things that you already saw. We had the iced coffee that was over here that I've created, some small little leaves, all types of fun stuff. This is where the paper clip came from. So what I thought we would do for today's lesson is recreate this chat bubble that we have right here. We'll start from scratch, and then I'll show you how to transfer this onto the rubber block, and then we'll go ahead and carve this one out. The reason that I'm going to go with this one is it's not overly complicated. Something like this paper clip does take a little bit more time because there are small little details inside of here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on a brand new blank page, and all we're going to need for this is going to be your soft lead pencil. If you have an eraser around, you can use that if you need it, but really you just need these 2 things. What I tend to do, just to know the amount of space that I'm working with, is I'll just take my rubber block and I'll just draw a quick line around here just to give myself a frame of reference of how much space I have. If I was going to be drawing something bigger or I thought that I was going to be going out of bounds, this is just a really great way to keep yourself inside or know, hey, I might need to split this up into 2 blocks instead of 1. Since we're going to be working smaller though, we're just going to need this space right here. So let's go ahead and start to sketch out this chat bubble. What I'm going to do for this first is just create my chat bubble. And all that it is a rectangle with a small little chat triangle here at the bottom. We're going to draw all the way across and down. Now what we need to do is create that extra shadow that's on here. And the way that we're going to do that is just by drawing some angles on all of these endpoints here. This will let me know how far I need to go with my lines as I'm drawing them out. What I like about adding shadows is that it adds extra dimension to a 2-dimension thing, like a piece of paper. You can also do this with gray Tombow markers or colors if you want, but let's go ahead and build it into the actual stamp, and that way it'll reduce one extra thing that we have to draw on the page when we're creating our weekly. When you're using your pencil, you do want to make sure that you're getting
really good coverage, because this graphite in the pencil is what we're going to use to then transfer this over onto the rubber block. I'm going to go ahead and just clean up this top line real quick. All right, so this is going to be the chat bubble that we're going to create. There's two different ways that you can transfer things onto the rubber block. Actually, if we wanted to completely skip over the tracing paper part, you could sketch right onto your rubber block with your pencil or your pen. Not a problem at all. It actually works really well. The thing is that sometimes trying to erase that, if you're trying out different ideas or need to, it can get a little bit messy. So I don't usually like to do that method, but you most certainly can. The method that I like the most is just a really quick graphite transfer. What I like to do is take this sheet where we drew on top of the tracing paper. You want to grab the graphite side that you drew on, and we're going to take that and we're going to bring it right over top of our rubber stamp here. You do want to give yourself a little bit of extra room, but because this is a fresh block, we're going to work right here on the bottom corner. Now to transfer this, you can do it a few different ways. I told you about the bone cutter or the folding tool. This is what I like to use because it's nice and easy. All I'm going to do here is take that, hold this into place, and rub right over top of our sketch here. If you don't have a folding tool, you can actually just use another end of your pencil. You could even draw right over top of this as well. And I've also seen other people use the back end of spoons and other things like that. All you really want to do is apply some pressure so that you can get your graphite transfer over onto your rubber stamp. So here we are, we've got our design over on our rubber stamp. The next thing that I like to do once it's on here is actually go over top of this with a fine liner or a marker. The reason is it's graphite, and that's going to smear over time. And as you're working through this and your hand is rubbing against it, it can get a little bit messy. So I'm just going to use one of these Uniball pens here. You could use a Sharpie marker or anything that you want. It's not really brand specific. You just want to make sure that you're able to draw over top of these. And it doesn't have to be a perfect drawing. You just want to get your main ideas down. And this is going to make it nice and easy for you to carve around it when you actually start to carve, which we're going to do in just a second. I'm not going to color this all the way in, but I do want to just put this black line down here to remind me, don't cut this part out. The next thing that we're going to need is going to be just one of our cutting mats and our X-Acto blade. And when we're cutting this out, we want to make sure we're leaving a little bit of room here because we want to be able to press that down, but you don't want to leave too much. I am going to keep cutting on top of this cutting mat. I just want to make sure I'm protecting my background that's here as I'm doing that, just because the gouges and things that we're going to be using can be sharp and they can cut right into your tabletops. When it comes to our tools, as I mentioned in the supply part of this, you have your main handle here, and then you have different blades that come with these kits, and they come in different sizes and they have numbers on them as well. So if you ever need to buy replacements, you can know what size you're going for. Each one of these sizes, though, do different things. For instance, we have this number 8 here. This has a curved edge and it's very wide. This is going to be used for removing large sections of the rubber as we're cutting it out. This is the number 1 blade. It's just a smaller version of the one we were just using here with the rounded edge. We have the number 6 here, and that has a V shape on it. That's going to be for cutting in deep into those tight edges as you're going around. While these are great, I personally like working with these flex cut tools. This is the micro palm set, and it comes with 4 different size gouges inside of here. And I like them because they're very small, and I tend to work very small and very detailed with my stamps. So we have this number 9, that's a 1mm small U shape. We have this next one that is a 1.5mm U. We've got our 2.5mm U, And the one that I use most of the time is a 45-degree angle with 1mm V. The reason I like that one so much is that I get right into these details, and that's what we're going to be using. If you don't have the flex cut tools and instead you went with these different size blades, I'm actually going to recommend that you start with the number 6 that's here. That's going to get you that nice curve, and as we're going around these details here, you'll see that that works a lot better than some of the wider ones as you're going through. All right, so I have my gouge here. This is that V shape, the 45-degree 1mm for the flex cut that we have. And if not, you're going to be using one of your other smaller V-cut tools that you have. The first step of this is we're actually going to start with an outline. We're going to outline the inside of this chat box first, and then we're going to come outside and outline around the edge. The reason that we do this is it gives you a really good deep cut as you're going around, because as we start to increase the size of our blades, they're going to run right parallel next to that without getting too close to the edge. When you have really fine edges like this, it's just important to take your time. This isn't necessarily something you speed through for a few different reasons. One, you make a mistake with this rubber, there's no going back. Also, you want to be really careful if you're moving too fast because these gouges and these blades are sharp and you will cut right through your little fingers. I'm by no means an expert. I've only been doing this for about 6 months to a year, but there's a lot of things that I've learned over time and that others have taught me too. The most important part around safety is make sure you're always cutting away from yourself. Even when I work, I sometimes have a bad habit of grabbing the rubber block on the edges that I'm cutting towards. You just want to position your hands and your fingers a little bit further away so that even if your gouge does slip, it's not going into your finger. There are going to be times, though, when I'm working really close and very small where you'll see me maybe pick it up with my finger. Just really important to make sure that you're stopping first before you're picking up the extra rubber pieces. So let's go ahead and start. We'll put in some music right now as we're taking our time and cutting around the edges of our stamp. As you're working with the stamps, you'll see that you're going to have a lot of these little shavings that are going to be all over the place. One thing that I did is I just took an old mason jar that I have, and I just wrote little lino cuts on it. And this is actually where I keep all the extra little rubber scraps that I have just while I'm working. Once this thing fills up, I dump it. So now we have our outline on here. It doesn't have to be precise, but as you're working, get as close or far away as you need. I know for me sometimes when I'm working on these, I'm like right up on it. I really want to make sure I'm getting close to those lines, but you don't want to go right over top of them because like I said, once you cut through that rubber, there is no going back. Now that we have our outline, the next thing that we're going to be doing here is taking the next size up in the blade and we're going to cut around it one more time. I started with that 45-degree V cut, and now I'm going to be moving to my next size, which is going to be the middle size. It's not the smallest one, but it's also not the big wide one. This is the 1.5 millimeter. And what I'm doing now is just going to go right outside of that line using where we cut already as my guide, as I'm going to go around the outside and then the inside. I love carving stamps. It's just such a soothing feeling, slowly cutting away at this rubber. Now what we're going to do is remove even larger pieces by taking the next size up. So in this case for the flex cut, this is going to be the 2.5 millimeter that I'm going to be using to take out larger spaces. If you're using one of the other blades, you're going to want to go with something bigger like the number 10, which has the deeper U-cut inside of it. Or in this case, the number 8 could really work well as well. Since I've been using the flex cut, I do just want to show you about this blade as we're using it here, just to show you the difference between that. Because these are smaller, let me just show you an example here. If I cut further away from here, I'm only going to be getting about this much out using this size here. And if you're working with larger pieces, you don't want to be doing this all day long. While it's soothing, it's not that soothing. So you'll see that when we're using these other blades here, this takes a much wider point. I love that it's wider, but the problem is that sometimes I find it a little too hard to control when it's that wide. You're just really paying attention to where you're cutting and making sure you're not getting too close to the line. That's the other reason I like to slowly cut away at the outside and inside. It gives me a little bit more room for mistakes if I cut a little bit too close. So we're going to use this wider one and we're going to go ahead and cut out a little bit more around the outside and the inside, and then we'll go ahead and shape it with our X-Acto blade before we give our first test print. This is one of my favorite parts. I find this to be so relaxing and so soothing, pushing this blade through this rubber. Just make sure that you're being careful, especially when you're getting closer to the edges. Because we had already previously cut there, if you're pushing too hard towards the edge, your blade can jump and we're going to cut right through that line that we went around before. So just make sure you're just taking your time. There's no need to rush. I'm not completely done, but I just wanted to take a moment just so we could see and you could check out exactly where we are with this. We've carved around this pretty good, but there's still some parts that are a little bit higher raised. We don't need to dig super deep into this to create this stamp, but we do need to make sure that it does fall below the main line that you have here, because this is going to be the part that we cut. When I've made it to this point, what I like to do is start to shape this a little bit more, because I don't want you to have to cut, and I certainly don't want to have to cut extra pieces that I don't need to. So in this case, I wanted to leave a little bit of extra space, but I am going to cut around the outline of this chap box, and I'm just going to use my X-Acto blade here. I'm not getting super close, but I am getting just close enough that I have a little bit of space around that outside, but not too much. That's always the challenge that I find, especially when I first got started. But over time, you start to learn exactly how much is too much. It's also good to get a good cut on these, because when you're using these, if your stamp is too big, you're going to have a hard time finding where it is when you're trying to place it down. So it's another good reason to give yourself a little bit of shape around your stamp as you're creating it. Okay, I've gone about as far as I think I want to go with this. It's like anything, you start to cut and you get closer and closer, and then before you know it, you can't get back. I do have an extra scrap box that I've been using over time, but it's finding what's a good scrap to keep and what's not a good scrap to keep. Inside of here, I have a bunch of different sizes and pieces that I'm using, but sometimes they're just not big enough or wide enough or too small of a sliver that you're going to need. And as much as I don't like to throw things away, I also know that I don't want to have to keep a bunch of extra things I'm never going to use. But just take a look at your sizes as you're going through. You can create stamps with small little pieces like this using these flat edges here if you want. You could even do some cool dividers with some of these larger pieces, but only if you think you're actually going to use them. Usually I'm keeping pieces that are about this size inside of here that I can cut up into smaller pieces and create smaller stamps out of. Now that we've cut that down, I'm just going to go in and just continue to cut away at the edges of this so that this outside edge is going to fall below where we're going to stamp. I'll even start to cut the edges on an angle here just to round it out a little bit. That gets rid of the extra raised part that's on the edges of this usually. It's a really nice way just to curve it off so it doesn't become a problem. You'll see that I start to hold this up a little bit closer. This is just for me to get a good eye on where things might look like they're a bit too raised. When we do our test print, it'll 100% show where things are too raised. And it also makes it easier to see some of those small little pieces that you're not going to be able to see when you're just carving this like this at first. So instead of driving myself crazy, let's go ahead and do that first test print just so we can see what this looks like and we can carve out any little extra pieces that shouldn't be there for our print. You can use whatever you want to do your test print. I've been using this small little notebook for a while now just to try things out as I'm using them. It's good for first print. You can start to see any little pieces that you miss and then keep breaking it down from there. So I'm going to go all the way to the back onto fresh page. And let's try this one out. I'm going to be using this VersaFine black ink. I like this a lot. It's really good for fine details. I've had a lot of success with it, but you can use any type of ink pad that you might have at home. What I've learned over time, instead of taking your stamp and you dabbing it onto the ink pad, I've learned from other experts that you take your ink pad and you dab it onto your stamp. This does a few things for you. One, make sure that you get that nice even coverage as you go across. And also you don't get a bunch of the ink prints on your fingertips as you're starting to work through this. Once I put down that ink, you can already see some of the areas here where it's a little bit more raised than the others. We'll likely need to cut those down, but let's go ahead and do that first test print just to make sure. We're going to lay that down and we're just going to press on it with our hands. All right. I kind of actually like that texture, but because we're going for a nice clean look, I'm going to cut that out just to show you that process. But that first test print is a fantastic way to see exactly how something is looking. Because we're carving into the stamp, right? You're removing things. You're kind of starting from a flat surface and going down. So you can't gain anything back. So sometimes you are going to have to make those choices early on, whether or not you want to keep something or not. I know that I don't want to keep these here, so I'm just going to use my other blades here. And I'm just going to pull across these and just cut them out. What I like about using the ink for that test print, like I said, it raises it up for you so you can see really easily what you need to cut out of your stamp or what you might need to keep. For these smaller details though, I am going to go back to my flex cuts. It just gets inside of those spaces a lot better. Okay, so we cut out all the extra pieces that we saw when we did that first print. So now let's go ahead and do it again. We're going to go ahead and ink our block by taking the stamp ink and putting it to the stamp versus the other way around. Go ahead and flip it back here. We're going to press it down. And as you can see, we got a much cleaner stamp here. All of the extra little pieces here are gone. Those little areas in the corner are gone too. So now we're ready to go ahead and take our stamp and create our weekly spread inside of our bullet journal. As I mentioned inside of the supplies, I'm going to be using an Archer and Olive notebook here. This is a really fantastic notebook. I've loved using these for a while now. It has 160 GSM paper, which holds on to everything from pens to watercolor, and even does a pretty good job with stamps as well. I have noticed, just because of the amount of ink that sits on these when you do press them down, there can be a little bit of ghosting on the page, but I've never had bleed through. And bleed through means that your ink or paint are going straight through the paper onto the other side. I just want to give you that heads up so you're not disappointed if you start to see a little bit of something come through on these pages. It all depends on how thick you're going with something. But again, never bleed through, but a little bit of ghosting, which means you can sort of see an imprint on the other side. If you're unfamiliar with bullet journaling is an analog way to track things that are going on. These are tasks or to-dos or notes, or also used for reflection and gratitude as well. It's a mix of a to-do list and a journal, kind of all put together. If you want to learn more about bullet journaling as a whole, you can go to bulletjournal.com, or you can head over to my YouTube channel where I actually have an intro to bullet journaling video where we use something as easy as a lined grid notebook. Nothing fancy, pen and paper, we're good to go. I mentioned earlier that I'm all about functionality inside of my bullet journal, and that's exactly what I'm focused on when I'm doing this. I want to leave room for notes and tasks. That's what I'm about. That's what I need to try to accomplish as a part of this. If you have other needs, you're going to design your page or your notebook how you need them. We're going to do a really quick and easy weekly spread here, and all that I'm going to do is just cut these pages into thirds. I'm actually going to leave a little bit of room here at the top for our header for this week, but otherwise I'm going to have space for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, and the weekend over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our stamp here as the header for that week. So it's going to have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and all the way through the week that we're going to write inside of the space that we carved out for that block. To do this, I'm going to keep it really simple for myself. What I've done is from the bottom of the page is I counted up 10 squares, and then I'm just going to draw a quick line across the page here. If you're interested in picking up an Archer and Olive notebook, you can use my discount code, which is menwhobullet10, and that also gets you 10% off anything that you want to buy from Archer and Olive, especially with these beautiful notebooks. What I've loved about bullet journaling is that you can create whatever you want. With a blank notebook, your week is totally up to you. I like to add little bits of design. It allows me to be creative like this inside of my journal. So this is my style. Of course, you can do this in a much more simple way. There's a very core bullet journal way that you do this with no design, and everything revolves around your bullets and your rapid logging and your weekly and daily logs that are inside of here. But for today, we're having some fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my stamp. We're going to go ahead and ink that stamp. Then I'm going to take this and we are going to place it right about center inside of our square here. That leaves about 2 squares at the top and 2 at the bottom. And we're going to place that down here. I've come to embrace stamps from a standpoint that it's not always going to be perfect. Sometimes stamps are messy. That's just the reality of stamps and ink. You're going to get it on your finger. You're going to smudge it somewhere. Maybe you're going to get a little bit of something different every time you stamp. I've come to accept it, and I'm letting you know so that you don't get frustrated with yourself as well as you start stamping. But as you do it more, you learn little tips and tricks. And like I mentioned, taking my stamp ink and bringing it to my stamp versus the other way around has been one of the biggest game changers for me. Before I learned that little trick, I was taking my stamp and I was putting it on top of the ink pad here, which was doing 2 things. One, getting a lot of extra ink on here it didn't need, but I used to also get ink right on my fingertips. So when I placed my stamp down, you'd have the stamp and then little fingerprint tips on the page as well. So in that case, you'll see I have a bad habit of going back and forth on my techniques. The whole entire time I was pressing the ink to the stamp and I was doing good, but then you'll see this last time I just noticed I took the stamp to the ink and it actually pressed down extra ink so we got some extra lines. Not the end of the world, but unintentionally showing you the difference between the 2 different techniques. We can go ahead and put everything away. If you're ever interested in cleaning off your stamp ink, there are a few different ways you can do it. I just always use an extra scrap piece of paper towel or wet paper towel that I just dab the stamp onto and then the ink will slowly come off. I've also heard that baby wipes are really great to use, but my kids are older now and I don't have a lot of those extra ones lying around, so the paper towel works great for me. So now we have our entire weekly here, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and the weekend. What this is going to do is we're going to use this space to put in the title for the week. And then this whole section over here will be for tasks and notes and things as you go throughout. We'll also just do a really quick header across the top here. You can do a lot of different things. I like to just put the month that's here and maybe the date range. You could also do a quote if you want. The bullet journal is your oyster. You can do whatever you want inside of it. Just make sure it fits your needs. You don't always have to fit into somebody else's. What I'm going to do for each of the days of the week is just a fun lettering technique that I like to use. I'm not awesome at lettering. It's something I'm definitely trying to get better at, but I also like to have some fun with it. So something I've been doing is just alternating between big letters and small letters as I write things out. So in this case for Monday, I'm going to write it with a large M and a small O. And I'm just going to alternate each of those letters as I go through. It's just something fun that I've been doing, and sometimes will grab people's attention. They'll be like, oh, that looks kind of cool. And because the stamp is a little bit more of an organic shape and it's not exactly perfect, it's also super fun and kind of makes it feel almost like a comic in a way. Unintentional, but looks pretty neat. And I spelled Tuesday wrong. We're just gonna add a little E in there. See, when I'm super focused, don't pay attention to spelling. So we've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and our weekend. The last thing I'm going to do up here is just write in the month. We'll use the same lettering style just to keep it consistent, and then we'll be all set up for our week. I'm actually going to add a quote over here, one of my favorites from Maya Angelou, which is, "You can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have." So we have a super fun black and white weekly spread here. We created our own handmade stamp that we then use for each of the days of the week in containers. And now we can continue to use this anywhere else that we want inside of our bullet journal or to decorate other things as well. You start to build your own stamp collection for yourself. We also had some fun with lettering here, just changing the small and the large lettering as we went across, fixing some mistakes along the way. And we left space here at the top for a header. You can add more color or doodles or even create some other stamps if you wanted to inside of here, and add whatever you need to your week. And then you can start to put in your task and your to-do list on this weekly for you to remind yourself of what's going on.
All right, that was super fun. Thank you so much for hanging out during this lesson today. I had so much fun creating that stamp and then using it inside of our bullet journal along with you. And now that you know how to do it, you can go absolutely crazy and create more stamps for yourself. As you saw, I have them in all shapes and sizes. And anytime you have a creative idea, it's easy to transfer that right onto that rubber and then use your carving tools to get the design that you want. I'd love to continue interacting with you online, so make sure you follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Men Who Bullet. And don't forget, you can sign up for my email newsletter to get some extra freebies from me, as well as tips and tricks around bullet journaling and organization. Head over to menwhobullet.com and you'll see the email sign up in the navigation. Thanks again for hanging out during this lesson. I hope you have a great rest of your time during this summer workshop retreat, and I will talk to you very soon. Happy planning and stay creative.